China on the path of modernization. In the 1890s, he began to build a political movement, an avowedly revolutionary movement, aiming not to reform and adapt to the institutions of the imperial state, but to abolish them and replace them. After the defeat of China in the Sino-Japanese War in 1895, the failure of the reform movement in 1898, and the further debacle of the Boxer Rebellion in 1899 and 1900, Sun's ideas began to become more and more popular. Many young Chinese, educated Chinese, turned away from the efforts to salvage what they saw as the moribund regime of the Qing, and saw Sun's ideas of a revolutionary transformation of China as the way to go, as the more attractive option. He puts together, in the first decade of the 20th century, a sort of umbrella organization called the Tongmeng Hui, or the Revolutionary League, which brought anti-Qing groups of a range of ideas with a range of particular political perspectives together to strengthen them by giving them a common focus and a common program. He traveled extensively within China and increasingly outside China, around the world, speaking in public, speaking to overseas Chinese communities, and raising money. He was apparently a very effective communicator, did a very good job of political agitation and propaganda, and was a first-rate fundraiser. He probably made in some ways, his major contributions by raising money to support various kinds of revolutionary activities. Some of those revolutionary activities took the form of military uprisings or at least violent popular uprisings against Qing government officials in various parts of China, particularly in the far south. None of these, however, were successful. They all were rather botched efforts, and the reputation of the nationalist movement, the revolutionary movement, was certainly not as a highly effective rebel organization or terrorist group, but rather more as a political movement. All these efforts to spark a popular rebellion which would overthrow the dynasty ended in failure. In 1911, however, the dynasty does collapse, and the way that this comes about was rather particular. The efforts of reform, which had been put in place in the wake of the Boxer Rebellion, begin to stall out after 1908. In 1908, both the Guangxu Emperor and the Empress Dowager, Cixi, die. In fact, they die within just a few hours of each other. The Guangxu Emperor the evening before the death of the Empress Dowager Cixi. And as a result of this, a little boy named Puyi is placed on the throne, and he becomes the last of the Qing emperors, made famous, of course, by Bertolucci's film of that name, The Last Emperor. As a little boy, of course, he didn't exercise any actual political authority, and his conservative uncles, who constituted a regency council for him, slowed down the reform program, which Cixi had been presiding over. As a result of this, even the minimal progress that the Qing had been making towards sustaining itself through political adaptation comes to a halt, and the dynasty enters into a sort of final period of rigidity. Within the dynastic system, however, there is one sector where modernization and particularly modern ideas are becoming increasingly powerful, and this is the military. The military had been, of course, the subject of a lot of efforts by the self-strengtheners in the 1870s and 1880s and into the early 1890s. And even after the defeat of the modern Chinese army by the Japanese in 1895, there were still efforts made to develop a modern sector in the Chinese military. Again, after the Boxer Rebellion, after the eight-power imperialist army comes into China in 1900, when it's withdrawn in 1901, the Chinese army goes back on a program of modernization. And a very somewhat puzzling figure, certainly a critical player in this process, is a man named Yuan Shikai. Now, Yuan Shikai, we met briefly earlier in the context of the 1898 reforms. He was one of the Chinese officials who turned against the reformers, sided with the Empress Dowager Cixi, and took part in the suppression of the reforms in 1898, which in some ways seems sort of out of character, perhaps as a modernizer, as an advocate of the modern army within the Qing state. One would have expected to see him be on the side of the reformers of 1898. But for his own reasons, he chose not to support them and instead to ally himself with the conservative elements amongst the Manchu leadership. But that winds up preserving his power and influence. And in the first decade of the 20th century, he is one of the more powerful figures, and certainly one of the more powerful Chinese officials within the Qing government. In 1911, he comes to play a pivotal role. The modern military, the modern units within the military, had become a focal point for political activity. This in some ways was probably an unintended consequences of the efforts to modernize the army, but the officer corps in particular, and especially the junior officers who were reasonably well educated, were exposed to Western ideas, not just about military affairs, but about history and politics, began to develop ideas of their own, which were rather radical and progressive. The Revolutionary League, the Tongmenghui, Sun Yat-sen's organization, devoted a lot of effort to trying to organize among the ranks of the junior officers in the army, and they were reasonably successful in doing this. Many junior officers joined the Revolutionary League. Many junior officers were involved in conspiratorial groups, thinking about planning different kinds of insurrection. In October of 1911, one of these groups in Wuhan, in central China, was plotting some bombings, preparing to try to trigger a popular uprising, and their activities were accidentally discovered. A bomb that was being prepared by one of them within a part of the city that was actually under the control of the Russians. It was a Russian economic concession, exploded. And